Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. I first just want to introduce myself. My name is Jadi Cheng, and I'm a Community Engagement Coordinator here at the Center for Policing Equity, and I'll be your facilitator today. On behalf of our co-founders, Dr. Philip Atiba-Goff and Dr. Tracy Gazee, I want to welcome all of you to this presentation of the findings of our Justice Navigator assessment on the Newington Police Department, followed by a Q&A session with my colleagues from CPE and Chief Clark from NPD. As we know, there are few discussions as urgent these days as that of how communities and municipalities can deliver public safety with equity and care at its core, and I'm hopeful that this event can add to those conversations. I'm joined on this virtual panel by my colleagues, Dr. Yolanda Smith, a senior implementation strategist on our law enforcement initiatives team, Matthew Graham, a senior data analyst on our Justice Navigator team. Unfortunately, Charlotte Reesing, our government affairs manager on the policy team, couldn't make it. She's stuck in a storm. And Chief Stephen Clark from the Newington Police Department. Thank you all for being here tonight. We have a very informative agenda in store for you today. First, Dr. Smith will provide some context into the history of our relationship with the Newington Police Department and the goals of our engagement. Following that, Matthew Graham will walk through the findings of our Justice Navigator assessment, which is also available online at justicenavigator.org, covering our analysis of Newington PD's vehicle stop, calls for service, and use of force data. After that, I'll speak to our initial policy recommendations for the Newington Police Department. I'll then speak to the next steps of our engagement in Newington, how community members can get involved in our work, and some of the tools and resources we provide alongside the assessment. We'll then open up for a Q&A session to answer any questions you may have for us or the Chief. I want to thank everyone again for joining us today from the Newington community and beyond. And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Yolanda Smith.
Thanks, Giadi. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Yolanda Smith. I'm an implementation strategist at the Center for Police and Equity, and I'm also the point person for the Newington PD account. So just a little bit about me. I'm a retired police lieutenant from the Newark Police Department in Newark, New Jersey. I have over 25 years of public service experience, and I've had the pleasure of working closely with Chief Clark and supporting him in his commitment to ensuring that Newington PD's policing practices are fair and equitable for all of the Newington community. So let's begin with who CPE is and what we do. CPE was founded in 2008 by Dr. Philip Atiba-Goff and Dr. Tracy Gazee. We are a nonprofit organization committed to research and action, working alongside communities and law enforcement agencies. In this work, our goal is twofold. One, to identify racial disparities in policing behaviors, and two, redesign public safety systems. Nationwide, law enforcement agencies seek sustainable ways to improve relationships with the communities they serve. These same communities know exactly what they need to keep everyone safe, and their perspective is invaluable to redesigning public safety. CPE provides data-driven interventions for social justice. Our team comprises research scientists, race and equity specialists, data experts, former law enforcement leaders, and community engagement specialists. We combine data on law enforcement practices with community feedback to create levers for social, cultural, and policy change. We use science to advocate for large-scale and meaningful change in public safety by conducting analyses that identify racial disparities. We use these analyses to equip law enforcement leaders with a clearer picture of where to begin making changes so their departments can provide fair and equitable law enforcement services to their communities. This is vital because CPE believes that all communities, particularly Black, brown, and vulnerable populations, have a right to human dignity, safety, and access to equitable support systems to ensure their safety. So by teaming up with law enforcement agencies like the Newington Police Department, looking to make a meaningful change, we can unclog the drain filled with intergenerational mistrust and pain and bridge the divide between public safety and the community through communication, collaboration, and partnership. Next slide. So what has been accomplished so far with the Newington Police Department? This partnership between Newington PD and CPE began in October of 2017, when Newington PD voluntarily partnered with us to participate in the National Justice Database, for which they provided data for this assessment. What is the National Justice Database, or NJD as we call it? Well, it is the largest collection of recorded police behaviors related to the outcomes of their interactions with citizens. The idea is to build trust and confidence in the law enforcement community. Now, although we call this a database, the NJD is strictly a research database for CPE researchers and scientists. However, as a participating partner, CPE has provided Newington PD with an analysis of the data they've provided at no cost to the department. More specifically, we've analyzed the outcomes of their interactions with citizens during use of force incidents from 2013 through 2019, vehicle stops from 2017 through 2019, and calls for service and officer-initiated activities from 2017 through 2019. Next slide. The problems of policing are more than problems of department policy and behavior. They are the direct result of our collective failure to value the fullness and dignity of Black life. Now, this isn't a report card or investigation of whether these outcomes are justified within the parameters of law enforcement. This analysis is a tool for Newington PD to make data-driven changes that advance more equitable policing. So, the Justice Navigator assessment, which is that tool, shows where there are disparities in policing and how significant those disparities are. The goal here is to examine whether some racial groups in Newington experience police contact more frequently than others. We want to identify any racial disparities in police interactions with the community and provide areas for further investigation so that Newington PD can dive deeper into the data, research the why, and address any identified disparities. This report is the baseline of those outcomes, where Newington PD can compare itself to Newington PD in the future. Now, let me add, this report does not prove or disprove racism in police personnel, practices, or policies. However, this report does outline racial disparities in Newington PD's interaction with the community during the study period. It's not a comparison to other law enforcement agencies, but it does allow Newington PD to see where they stand now and then come back in the future and view how these changes that they've implemented compared to this baseline report to determine if their efforts to reform have been successful. Next, you will hear from our senior data analyst, Matt Graham, who will present Newington PD's Justice Navigator assessment findings.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Yolanda. As Jetty mentioned, my name is Matthew Graham. I am the senior data analyst on the Justice Navigator product. So I'm going to go over some of the key findings from Newington's assessment. We assessed 3 areas, so use of force, vehicle stops, and calls for service. And so first, just looking at the department context, Newington PD has more than 45 sworn officers, serve a community of about 30,000 people. It's a majority white community, 77% of the residents are white, but there are also sizable populations of Latinx, Asian, and Black people. So first we'll look at use of force. And so the initial result, comparing the use of force, percentage of use of force incidents that involve people of each racial group compared to their share of the population, we see that so Black people make up 5% of the population of Newington, and made up 17% of the people against whom Newington PD officers used force. And similarly, Latinx folks make up 10% of the population and 25% of the people against whom officers used force. Whereas white people make up 77% of the population and just 57% of the people against whom officers used force. Here we see the number of use of force incidents per year, and we see from 2013 through 2018, it's very steady, between 20 and 30 incidents per year. It jumped pretty considerably in 2019, and we won't know whether that's a trend or just a blip until we get more data. But so hopefully we can continue this partnership and assess that in the months to come. Looking at the types of force used, the two most common types of force used by Newington PD are holds and takedowns, which is fairly common. For both of those types of force, Black and Latinx people were overrepresented relative to their share of the population. So 18% of holds were against Black people, who make up 5% of the population, and 28% of takedowns were against Latinx people, who make up 10% of the population. And now we'll switch to vehicle stops. And this is just some key findings. There are more figures and more analyses in the Justice Navigator itself at justicenavigator.org. So switching to vehicle stops, first we see that there was a decrease from 2017 to 2018, from about 5,400 stops in 2017 to 3,600 in 2018 and 4,000 in 2019. Again, we can't be sure if this is the beginning of a trend or just kind of a one-off until we get more data, but initial signs are promising. With vehicle stops, we don't compare to the resident population. So in the use of force, we looked at the percentage of the population that was Black and Latinx, and then the percentage of use of force incidents against those racial groups. We don't do that with vehicle stops because we acknowledge that the people driving in and through Newington are not necessarily going to reflect the racial demographics of the city itself. You've got commuters, you've got people just passing through. And so we don't look at that, but we can still look at, rates of stops for different racial groups. And so here we see Black people make up 18% of the people stopped while driving, and Latinx people make up 22% of the drivers stopped over this time period. Looking at search rates. So once stopped, how often are people of different racial groups searched? And we see that both Black and Latinx people are searched more than 3 times as often as white people. So for every 1,000 stops of Black people, 66 of those are going to result in a search, or did result in a search. Whereas for every 1,000 stops of white people, 21 of those resulted in a search. And then we look at contraband found. So did those searches turn up anything illegal? And so the first thing to see is across the board for every racial group, more than 2/3 of searches did not find contraband. And then looking at the comparisons by racial group, so we saw that Latinx people were searched 3 times as often as white people. And here we see that they actually had contraband found on them less often. So those searches, that disparity in the search rate would not be justified by the amount of contraband found. We see that Black people were found with contraband more often than white people, but the difference in search rates and contraband found rates, like the contraband found doesn't explain the entirety of it. So Black people were searched 3 times as often as white people. They had contraband found on them 1.4 times as often. So even though they have contraband found on them more often, it's not enough to justify that 3 times search rate that we saw. Looking at vehicle stop outcomes, we see that Black and Latinx people are arrested and cited more often than white people, while white people are more often released with a warning or no action. And then turning to our last section, this is calls for service and officer-initiated activity. In the use of force and vehicle stop section, we're really focused on racial equity, and we have some clear metrics and indicators of what constitutes racial equity. With the calls for service section, we're not so much focused on that. We're really focused on what are people calling the police for? What are they calling 911 and asking the police to do? And what are police doing when they're initiating activity themselves? And this is meant as a platform for the community and the police department to start having discussions about what the community wants the police to be doing, particularly when they're initiating activity themselves. It's also a springboard to start discussions if Newington wants to pursue this for alternative response models, which I'll discuss in a moment. So the first thing we see is, around the country, there's this sort of sense that police are running from, robbery to assault to theft, right? Like very serious call, one after the other, and they don't have much time. And what we see in almost every jurisdiction we've analyzed is that those really serious calls actually make up less than 10% of the activity officers are involved in. So like I said, assault, robbery, theft, threats, that makes up 7% of the events that Newington officers responded to between 2017 and 2019. Then we look at, so we divide the calls between those that were requested by the community via a 911 call and those that were initiated by officers. And so here we're just looking at the 911 calls. What is the community asking the police to do? And we see that the two highest categories are public assistance, which is things like, vehicle stalled or obstruction in the roadway, things where the community just needs someone to come deal with a problem, but not necessarily a violent or dangerous problem. And then medical fire. And to be clear, we removed from this analysis any calls that were dispatched to the fire department or EMS. And so these are calls where police are showing up as secondary responders. And so this is where we start to see opportunities for discussions around alternative response models. So in other communities, we've seen like for these public assistance calls, obstruction in the roadway, stalled vehicle, you could imagine like a public works personnel or other city personnel could handle that. These are often given to police because police are the resource that's available. But they don't require a badge and a gun per se to be dealt with. We've seen in at least one other jurisdiction where for non-serious traffic accidents, if it's just, you need someone from the city to come write a report for insurance reasons, that has typically been police, but it doesn't have to be. And so at least one other jurisdiction started a program where they train and certify, non-armed responders to those types of calls to complete the reports. And so this just, removes some of that burden from police so they can focus on the calls where they're actually needed. And the area where that's, most prevalent, the alternative response models is in mental health situations. And so we see over this time period, Newington police were called to 481 mental health crises. And this is an area where we've seen jurisdictions across the country starting up programs for alternative response or co-response models. So most officers are not trained to be able to effectively, deal with a situation with someone who's experiencing a mental health crisis, or they've received some minimal training. And so in recognition of that, other jurisdictions have started programs where they either send a social worker or someone trained in this area on their own, or they send them with a police officer, and the officer is there, for safety, but they're kind of, they stand back and let the social worker take the lead. And so we've seen a lot of promising programs like that across the country. And now I will hand it back to Giadi to discuss the policy foundation analysis.
Thank you, Matt. So at the request of the Newington Police Department, CPE conducted an introductory analysis of the department's general orders to identify opportunities to improve written policies. As part of this review, CPE analyzed Newington PD's general orders, stop and use of force reporting forms, and the departmental webpage. Specifically, the department's general orders relating to use of force, stops and searches, bias-free policing, anti-discrimination, public complaint systems, mental health response, and LGBTQ+ equity were included in this review. We also conducted an extensive interview with Chief Clark as part of this process. And I just briefly wanted to say that research shows that clear and explicit policies do a lot to reduce disparities and are more likely to lead to folks being treated more equitably. Written policies can be a powerful tool for setting clear, unambiguous expectations of officer behavior. When norms of expected behavior are clear, officers are more likely to treat people equally. For example, officers working under more restricted use of force policies have been shown to use force less readily than officers who are working under less restrictive policies. And in order to be effective, changes in administrative policy must be accompanied by training, community engagement, supervision practices, disciplinary norms, and organizational culture. Next slide, please. So a few example areas of where we made recommendations include use of force. We made recommendations related to the use of canines, deadly force, and chokeholds. Stops, looking particularly at curbing low-level traffic stops that are unrelated to safety, such as equipment violations and expired registrations. Engaging with community to explore alternatives to police enforcement of traffic violations to reduce disparities. Anti-discrimination, making recommendations looking particularly at hate groups and social media policies. Newington's complaint systems, increasing the accessibility to the public and explaining and clarifying complainants' rights. In terms of LGBTQ+ policies, we recommended adding sex, orientation, gender identity, and expression to reduce discriminatory policy. We also looked at social media and recommended a standalone policy on police interactions with people who are transgender. In terms of mental health response, we made some recommendations related to humanizing language and continuing to partner with the community to develop and fund alternative response to people experiencing mental health emergencies. In terms of data collection, we recommended expanding collection to include all stop dispositions, whether or not someone appeared to be experiencing a mental health emergency, and de-escalation tactics used. And all this information is available on the Justice Navigator site on the summary tab of the report. Next slide, please. Now, speaking about next steps, here at CPE, we believe that the ultimate measure of our success is the safety and well-being of the communities we serve. Because of that, your voice is central to the work that we're trying to do, and we're offering a few ways for you to speak about your experiences and goals in terms of public safety and racial justice, either with us or with your neighbors. Next slide, please. This Friday, February 24th, we're hosting a community roundtable from 6 to 7:30 p.m. at the Mortensen Community Center multipurpose room. All of you are welcome to join to speak to your vision and experience of policing and public safety and hear from other folks in your community. If you prefer to speak outside of a group setting, our team would love to find some time to chat while we're in town this week. We're here from today until Saturday the 25th or via Zoom. Feel free to scan the QR code on the screen or follow the link in the chat, which will drop shortly, to RSVP for the event, schedule a meeting, or just stay updated on our work in Newington and across the state. We also understand that while reports and conversation are critical in pushing the needle towards justice, action and solutions are what produce real change to our public safety systems. The Newington Police Department also recognizes this and has committed to working with CPE to address the identified disparities. Right now, we're developing the framework for us to facilitate the co-creation of solutions between the community and department to drive down these disparities and deliver more holistic and equitable public safety systems. Next slide, please. I also just wanted to briefly highlight some of the tools and resources that are available alongside our assessments on the Justice Navigator platform. So if you're interested in learning more about policing data, we provide a deeper dive into that data and the analysis process in general. There's a glossary of key terms that breaks down some of the jargon used by folks in this field, and a video that walks through a sample Justice Navigator assessment to help you understand the different types of analyses we conduct and what they mean. There are also guidelines on how to find, understand, and analyzing policing data, even if your department does not currently have a Justice Navigator assessment. For folks who are just looking to get a basic understanding of policing in America, we also have content for that. That includes a brief overview of the origins and history of policing in this country, the types of law enforcement agencies that typically operate in your community, and the work they do and personnel involved. All this information is geared towards helping community members take action to shape the models of public safety they would like to see. There are guidelines to improve the collection and reporting of police data, understanding that detailed and comprehensive data is vital to holding law enforcement accountable. There are also tips to ensure that strong and clear regulations are placed on law enforcement in two ways: strengthening written policy, which we've spoken about, and improving their accountability mechanisms. Finally, there's guidance on how to structure conversations and strategies around the redesign of public safety broadly. Our roadmap for exploring new models of funding public safety covers topics such as reducing the footprint of law enforcement and bolstering other resources and services in communities that have been traditionally and historically underserved and underinvested in. And again, all this information is available on the Justice Navigator website, justicenavigator.org, and at policingequity.org. Next slide, please. So that concludes our presentation for this evening. And with that, we'll open up for questions and answers. And just to remind you of who is here to answer your questions, I invite my fellow panelists to reintroduce themselves, starting with Dr. Yolanda Smith.
Thanks, Giadi. Again, I'm Dr. Yolanda Smith, and I'm a senior implementation strategist here at the Center for Policing Equity. I have a bachelor's degree in criminal justice, a master's degree in public administration, and I also have a PhD in public safety. Thank you for having me here tonight. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Matt Graham, so that he can introduce himself.
Thanks again, Yolanda. Again, I'm Matt Graham. I'm the senior data analyst on the Justice Navigator assessments. So happy to answer any stats or questions on the results, analyses, any of the technical aspects. Ciaran, do you want to introduce yourself? Or should I pass it to Chief Clark?
I think you could pass it to Chief Clark, Matt.
Good evening. My name is Steve Clark. I'm the Chief of Police for the Newington Police Department. Been the chief here now since 2015. So welcome.
Great, thank you all. So I just have a few questions that we got before the webinar. Chief, this first question is for you. I was wondering if you could speak to what the department has already done over the past few years since we started collecting this data to address racial disparities and burdensome policing. And are there any areas of focus for the next few years for the department?
Sure, good question. We've trained all our officers, and it's been dated now because we're 2019, so we're 3 years from that time. But all the officers here have been trained in bias-based policing. So we continue to look at that training. We have a number of officers that have been trained in crisis intervention. The department now, I believe, is about 25% of all the department officers have been trained in CIT. We're collecting more and more data on our activities, trying to create more meaningful benchmarks. When you look at trying to establish benchmarks for identifying disparity, accounting for all the local variables that are involved in creating that benchmark. So we've been collecting a lot of data. Some of the things that we've seen some progress already. We received the 2022 use of force report for the department, and last year we had only 10 use of force incidents. So that's a significant drop to what we've seen. And of those 10, none of them involved African Americans. So I'm proud of the work that our officers do each and every day. They do a great job. We have a tremendous amount of support in the community. I'm interested in listening to what a lot of the community stakeholders have to say about, what they see in a department and where they would like to see the police department go.
Thank you, Chief. And this next question, I think, is for Matt or Yolanda. When can we expect a follow-up report for Newington PD?
Matt, you want to take that, or you want me to take it?
I can talk about like the length once we get the data, if you want to talk about where we're at in the process of extending the partnership.
Sure. So right now we have our baseline report, and we'll use that to do some a deeper dive into the disparities within Newington. And so we'll collect more data, and then we'll go from there. Once we collect more data, then we'll have a better idea of a turnaround when we'll have another analysis out.
Yeah, so typically once we receive data, we can turn a follow-up report around in 4 to 6 months. And I think this data ended in 2019, so it's just a matter of formalizing the next steps of the partnership, collecting that data from the department, and then just getting to work on producing the next report.
Wonderful. Thank you both. And my next question, this is for you, Chief Clark. What role do you see the community playing in the work to be done to deliver more equitable public safety?
I think the community has a very important role. When I became chief back in 2015, the first thing I did is have a community forum for the public to come out and really express their thoughts and their feelings on the department and where they would like to see the department go. So I don't operate in a vacuum. I'm open-minded. I like to listen to what people have to say, especially those that live in town. And it's important to note that Newington is changing. I'm a lifelong resident of the town. The community is much more diverse now than it was when I was going to Newington High School, growing up here. So it's important that, people have a voice, and, I don't operate in a vacuum. So I take a lot of stock in what people have to say. So that's one of the reasons why, we signed up with CPE, and I think it's important. So.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I don't see any more questions in the Q&A. So we can wait a bit. If there are any lingering questions, feel free to follow the link in the chat to schedule some time with us to speak. You can always send us an email as well, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that you have after the fact as well. So we can wait on a bit more if folks have any questions. And if not, we can wrap up in a couple of minutes. Okay, I think we can go ahead and wrap it up. Again, if there are any lingering questions, feel free to follow the link in the chat. To stay up to date to the work that we're doing, would love to see some of you at Friday's event at the Mortensen Community Center. And with that, I want to thank you all again for attending. Chief Clark, my colleagues, thank you so much for attending. And have a good evening, everyone.